From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now, or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. Here's where it gets crazy. There's a huge asbestos cover-up. It's enormous. Think of the biggest cover-up you can imagine. This is bigger. This just mopped it. PvP. You may have already heard about this, but you probably do not know how deep it goes.
Yeah, it's like the big brother, the kind of progenitor to the Teflon, PFA cover-up featuring DuPont that we've covered in previous episodes. I mean, this is like the OG toxic cover-up material.
Oh, yeah. Agreed. I mean, I was surprised to find, we know that there are a lot of modern complaints and lawsuits and laws and controversies about asbestos today, but the first complaints and concerns, like provable health concerns about asbestos, date back to the 1800s, like 1897, 1899. There was a guy named H. Montague Murray who explicitly noted the deleterious health effects of this substance. Shout out to our friends on Facebook. I did pay attention. You are right, and thank you. So you'll see this claim that people in the days of ancient Rome may have also had concerns about asbestos and its health effects, but there's not really a primary source to back that up. That's just one of those, that's the definition of a factoid, right? Like, it sounds like it would be true. It sounds factual, but it's not. It's really the late 1800s is when we see the, what I would consider the first modern, let's call them actionable reports of danger here.
Ben, thank you for schooling me. I've been using Factoid incorrectly for years. I just thought it was like a cute little fact nugget, but it turns out that it is inherently false, right?
But that's the thing, man. With this language, how ultimately we're all kind of crowdsourcing, right? We're all voting. So if enough people use a word one way, if we all act like Alice in Wonderland's Humpty Dumpty, then it just means what we want. That's how you end up with the beautiful things in English where you have words like peruse, which are their own antonyms, right? Peruse means both to just sort of flip through something, and then it means also to scrutinize every word and read carefully. So I think a factoid can be both things. And if we can convince our fellow conspiracy realists to agree, then we may have just started the biggest, most unnecessary conspiracy of our careers.
So the first clearly documented death due to asbestos occurred in 1906. But again, based on how far back we know the stuff was being used widely, surely there were many, many more that preceded it. But we're talking about the 19th century here. It was a long, long time ago. What exactly makes asbestos bad for human beings? And more importantly, why were people not told of these risks if we had that level of like history?
Yeah, the first question is unfortunately pretty easy to answer. Asbestos can cause a number of medical conditions, provable, and a number of certain cancers. And it's not as if it's necessarily always just a contributing factor. In a couple of cases, we'll see that these conditions are almost exclusively caused by asbestos. You know what I mean? Like it's like the Riddler or the Joker leaving a trademark piece of swag at the scene of a crime. It can cause I'm not trying to be glib, but that is like, if you're a doctor, you can tell there's some conditions that just mean someone ran into asbestos.
I'm sorry, I laughed because I don't know if you guys have seen the new trailer for the Batman movie that's coming out, but the Riddler is a character, and the first thing you see in the trailer is like a spooky like push in at a diner to a latte that has a question mark in it. And that's the creepy thing he left behind was latte art. I thought that was a really odd choice.
I'm interested to see where they go with the Riddler because they're trying to give him more of a less of a campy vibe. Jim Carrey's
I like
Riddler
Paul Dano a lot. Like, you know, he's a excellent actor, and this movie apparently is going to have a lot more, you know, gritty kind of like serial killer vibes. So I'm definitely on board, but I did think it was a bit of an odd thing to lead with.
Yeah, agreed. But if you imagine, you're a doctor, and again, we're not giving medical advice. If you see someone that has a condition known as mesothelioma, then asbestos was involved. It was the hand behind the trigger. I mean, signs of this condition, this is insidious and enormously unjust. Signs of this condition might not appear until 30 or 40 years after exposure, which means that somebody could be exposed as a kid, or they could have grown up in a mining town. There were hundreds of those in the US. And then not until later in life, maybe 35, 45 years old, all of a sudden they get these kinds of conditions. And we're also talking cancer of the stomach, colorectum, pharynx, and so on.
With mesothelioma in particular, too, you might not see the signs of it for 30 or 40 years, but then it's also the kind of thing that takes a very long time to kill you. And it's very brutal and slow. And, you have to be on oxygen and you just short of breath all the time. I think it actually creates fluid in the lungs. So when you see people that have it, their breathing is just the most painful, labored thing you could possibly imagine. It's absolutely heartbreaking. There's a mining town in Montana, Libby, Montana, that has been looked at as like a great example of what long-term asbestos exposure does. And there's several documentaries about it you can find where they interview residents, and many of them that they talk to for the documentaries are doing just that. And it's very hard to watch, but I think an important watch.
Yeah. And that's not the only problem with breathing that asbestos exposure can cause. There's also this thing where it can scar your lungs. It can physically scar your lungs by breathing in those fibers and the parts that you may not even notice. It's like stuff that's just in the air, and you would just be breathing it, especially if you're working near it. But even if you're living near a place where, let's say, explosions occur in a mine that are trying to get asbestos out. It's called asbestosis, and it is another one of those horrible things where you're just going to be dealing with it because that's what your life is now. You have scarred lungs, and it's way harder for you to breathe.
And you can't unscar the lungs.
Exactly. One of the things that makes asbestos such a resilient building material is the idea that it's very hard to destroy. That's also true once it gets into your body,
Yeah. And these fibers on an individual level are microscopic. They are invisible to the unaided eye, which means that if you are walking through an area contaminated with this, you are not going to notice. You are just going to be breathing as normal until you're not. There's another non-cancerous lung condition it causes called pleural disease, which involves damage to the membrane known as the pleura that surrounds the lung and chest cavities. And this is what we're listing here, folks. This is not a list of just potential problems. Even today, right now, 2021, asbestos exposure is believed to be the #1 cause of work-related deaths in the world. And I haven't seen a Dangerous Jobs about that on Discovery. But approximately 90,000 people are going to die from an asbestos-related disease this year. And right now, an estimated 125 million people remain at risk of regular occupational exposure to asbestos. These are estimates, but these are not necessarily estimates that are up for debate. People have done the homework. The subreddit for this would be like, they did the math or something like that. Asbestos is still such a dangerous thing because it was embedded in so much of the world's construction for such a long time, but also because the nature of the damage it does means that people will live with it for a long time without knowing that damage has occurred. And a lot of people were involved in the industry. Asbestos mining was huge. We said there were like hundreds of mining towns. There were more than 100 operating mines in the US alone from like the 60s and the early 70s when it reached its height. The industry was growing as awareness of the dangers were growing. They were happening at the same time, which is kind of unusual.
It makes sense why there would be a cover up if those two things are true, right?
Oh yeah. I mean,
it's profitable. And it was easy to get right out of the ground, in these mining towns. And you ended up with situations where the one town, like Libby, for example, was built around this industry. And even if, as the people there maybe are starting to worry or be concerned, they also don't want to lose their livelihood. I mean, we know how some of these smaller kind of rural towns, if an industry goes belly up, so does the town. So it's a weird kind of double-edged sword where they're like, ooh, maybe this is really bad for us, but also we don't really want to lose our one industry. Maybe we'll keep our mouths shut about this condition that we might have developed.
Yeah, and that goes to local level and state level officials. That also, if anybody's lived in a one industry town, that every job ultimately relies upon that industry. Even if you're the family that runs the local diner, you've never been in a coal mine, but if the coal mine closes, then the diner isn't far off from closing as well. And Matt, you set us up earlier when you talked about open pit mining, which was the primary technique for mining asbestos in the U.S. and also across the planet. Let's maybe talk a little bit about this. What was open pit mining? What makes it different from other types of mining?
You've probably seen pictures of a mine like this before. It almost looks like tiered like roads that go around almost in an inverted pyramid style, right? They kind of go down towards the lowest level like that. The way to get the asbestos out in a mining situation like this is to plant explosives in one section that would, if you imagine it going all across a very long section, and then you'd explode what exists there, then you'd gather all of that up, all of that rock and, dirt and everything that's in there, and you'd basically get the asbestos and the usable substances and minerals out from that stuff you exploded out from the major rock structure.
Yeah. And as you can tell, when those explosions occur, this also fractures or, splinters the asbestos, and you have tiny microscopic pieces of contaminant that are in the air and unavoidable without protection. This isn't something where you can just hold your breath.
Not only that, I mean, it's similar to the way radioactive materials are carried, fallout zones, et cetera. I mean, it's not exactly the same, but this material being so durable, it just kind of goes to the surrounding areas on the wind and then ends up in the water supply and all manner of other ways that people can absorb it. The clothing of the miners, say, for example, even like, children or the family members, even if they're not directly breathing the stuff in from the explosion, they might be subjected to it when their family member comes home and the stuff's all over their clothes.
Yeah, it's important to note that when it becomes aerosolized like that, it really does get everywhere, including the sand and stones and rocks on beaches and, around waterfronts, on the water itself, on the plant life, on the animals. It gets everywhere because it's traveling through the air like this unseen mist that's just permeating everything.
Yeah. Forget communism. There's another invisible enemy in America at this time, right? People were also beginning to understand that asbestos may not be quite the miracle manufacturers were telling them it was. By the 1920s, medical journals in this country had already published articles linking asbestos to asbestosis, which, again, if a disease or condition is named after a substance,
it's the thing.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to say, oh, no, we didn't know. There are only so many letters in the alphabet, whatever.
We'll get to it later, too, but another place that was named after the thing is a mining town in Russia called Asbest, because they're really proud of their asbestos mining industry that is, unfortunately, I believe, still going on today.
Yeah, with a huge monument actually carved of asbestos and everything. Yeah, asbestosis is this fatal lung condition, like you guys were saying, where it scars the human breathing mechanism. Doctors, again, back in the 20s, in the 1930s, they were saying, probably the best way to prevent this condition, the scarring of the lungs, is to, limit people's exposure to asbestos. That seems pretty conclusive. Nobody was disagreeing. This wasn't a matter of serious debate amid those in the medical community, but it would still take decades and decades before this stuff was regulated in the U.S. and decades before workers were ever told that their jobs were giving them cancer. So this leads us to another question. Why the gap in information? Why was it still used so widely, and why is it even being used today?